Chapter 8 of Judge Burnham's Daughters. This recording is in the public domain. Judge Burnham's Daughters by Pansy. Chapter 8. Slippery Ground. In point of fact, that was what Judge Burnham did. The moment he had closed the door after his wife, he went straight to Dr. Whately and held out his hand with a winning smile, and said, in tones distinct enough to be heard throughout the room, "My friend, I hope you will allow me to apologize for what must appear unaccountable treatment. The fact is, my dear fellow, when religious fanaticism gets hold of a woman, she is really powerless before it, and I verily believe is not accountable for her acts. I am the one to blame. Since I understand how completely this strange feeling sways my wife, I should not have delivered your message today. I beg you will pardon her, and understand that no discourtesy was intended. It would have been the same if you had been a foreign ambassador." It was the best he could do for his wife's reputation. He knew this, and he did it well; and Dr. Whately, being a gentleman in society, at least accepted the apology with what grace he could muster, and outward calm was restored. But there were outgrowths from the storm, as there always are when passion holds sway for ever so short a time over the human heart. It had been said publicly, as Ruth had feared it would be, that religion must bear the blame for this unladylike action, and people talked as people will. Those least acquainted said, "What a pity it was that so fine a woman as Mrs. Burnham should be so completely under the control of fanatical ideas. They should think Judge Burnham would most fear for her reason." Others of them, less charitable, said that it was all very well for the judge to smooth over this little domestic hurricane, and he did it gracefully, but they believed, if the truth were told, that the poor fellow was used to them; and at any rate, if that was the style, when it came to their turn to marry, they hoped they might be delivered from a religious termagant, for, in their opinion, they were the worst kind. The young ladies talked the matter over with their father, and said, "Poor papa," and kissed him; and said they were "so sorry for him," and that he managed it all beautifully; that they felt at first as though they should sink through the floor, or, at least, wished that they could; but he was so gentle and so courteous, and they were so proud of him that they really almost forgot to be frightened and ashamed, because of their pride. And he felt himself to be a martyr who had borne himself very well indeed under persecution. Still, all this did not serve to make his indignation against his wife one whit less fierce. Nor did it serve to help her, when, with flushed cheeks and eyes that were red with weeping, she turned to him frankly the first moment that they were alone, and said, "Judge Burnham, I owe you an apology for this afternoon's experience. I beg you will forgive me. I ought not to have done what I did." Judge Burnham was engaged in removing his dress coat, and putting himself into his dressing gown. He had not seen his wife since the afternoon. She had sent a message by Kate, to the effect that she would like to be excused from dinner, as she had a severe headache; and the judge had bowed in reply, and had not gone at once to see what he could do for the headache, as his courtesy had always heretofore led him to do. Also, he had gone with his daughters and some of their friends to the city for the evening, merely going through the form of sending Kate to ask if there was anything he could do for Mrs. Burnham's comfort before departing. So now, although it was nearly 11 o'clock, Ruth was waiting up for him, and had met him with the sentence I have given you. He waited to adjust the collar of his handsome dressing gown to his mind before he answered, speaking slowly, coldly, "I should think there could not be two opinions about that." "No," said Ruth, controlling an almost irresistible impulse to burst into tears. "I should not expect any one to think it right, and I am very sorry that I annoyed you." "As to that," said the judge, putting his feet into some bright slippers that were waiting for them, "I must bear my own annoyances as best I can, but I regret that a friend of mine should be rudely treated in my own house, at the hands of my wife. It was not, of course, what could have been possibly foreseen." Wasn't it a graceful way of telling her that no one could have foreseen that she would lay aside her ladyhood and descend to rudeness? Silence for a few minutes, and then the gentleman made what he intended to be a gracious statement. However, I made what apologies I could for you, and am glad indeed that the spell, whatever it was, is over, and you are returned to reasonable ground once more." Then was poor Ruth dismayed. Had her attempt at undoing the mischief of the day been construed into a concession of principle for the future? She must explain, at the risk of being misunderstood. "Judge Burnham, I am afraid I have not made my meaning quite clear. I regret exceedingly the manner of my explanation to-day, but not the explanation. That is, it will be necessary for Dr. Whately, or any other person who wishes to call on me, to understand that I do not receive on the Sabbath; but I know that I could and should have made it apparent in some other way, and in a different spirit." "Mrs. Burnham, suppose we dismiss the subject and retire. We are not likely to agree, however long we may discuss it, and for myself, I confess that I am weary of the whole thing." And this was the outcome of her attempt at reconciliation. A polite gentleman's displeasure can be manifested in unmistakable ways, even toward his wife. The very extreme punctiliousness with which her husband attended to the minutest detail of whatever pertained to her, marked his cold dignity. There were none of the little carelessnesses which are sometimes permitted, even enjoyed, where there is perfect familiarity and perfect confidence. Still, as the days passed, the episode was not without its fruits, which were apparently healthful. The lady of the house struggled to show that she confessed herself, in a sense, in the wrong, and was willing to do all she could in the way of concession. She came to the parlor now each evening of her own will, not waiting to be summoned there by callers who inquired for her. This was a comfort, even to the young ladies; for there were always among the guests those whom they considered it a bore to entertain; and to have mamma in the front parlor to do the honors, leaving them free to saunter into the back parlor or the music room with favorite ones, was as it should be in their estimation. Judge Burnham viewed the change with satisfied eyes, and was by no means unmindful when his wife made her entrance, in a dark blue dress, instead of the black which she had so long worn. He complimented her on her appearance, took a rose from the vase and pushed it through the meshes of soft lace which she wore. During the evening he watched her with satisfied eyes as she entertained his friends; and, not having any marked interest in Dr. Whately, confessed to himself that he didn't know but he owed the fellow a vote of thanks, if this was to be the result of his impudence. For in his secret heart Judge Burnham thought it was bordering on impudence for a comparative stranger to send a special request to his wife to receive him socially on Sunday afternoon out there in the country, where Sunday calling was the exception and not the rule. The next thing was a dinner party, not a general and massive affair, but a little gathering of Judge Burnham's special friends, whom he delighted to honor. Such a gathering as had not been in the house since Ruth's father went away; and Judge Burnham, watching his wife, who exerted all her powers of entertainment, and overhearing one of the judges of the Supreme Court pronounce her an unusually brilliant woman, assured himself that he could endure the momentary embarrassment of that Sunday afternoon proceeding very well indeed, and was heartily glad that it had occurred; that probably Ruth needed something of the sort to bring her to her senses. She was certainly a queen among women. Now that the ice was fairly broken, society should see what a jewel he had in his keeping. So, altogether, it was a much mollified and very well contented husband who lounged among the cushions in the library, after the fatigues of the successful evening were over, and watched his wife while she unfastened and placed in water the flowers she had worn, and which he had himself selected and arranged for her. "They were very becoming," he said. "I had no idea that simple flowers would fit your style so well; but there was a charming contrast which just suited me. Your style is rather regal, you know, and I have always thought of diamonds in connection with it. Ruth, you were quite like your old self to-night, the self I used to admire before I appropriated it, only more matronly, of course, as became your years, and more beautiful, really. I think you ought to be grateful, my dear. Few women of your age retain their youthful beauty as you have done." Ruth laughed in a pleased way. She cared extremely little for youthful beauty, but she did care for her husband's admiration, and it had been so long since he had expressed any that she felt her cheeks flush under the spell of his words. She was glad over having pleased him. She told herself that she ought to have done these things before; that she had been selfish and hateful; that it was perfectly natural for a man to desire to receive his friends in his own house, and that if she had realized how much he desired it, she would certainly not have waited so long. She put herself into a white wrapper that was almost more becoming than her dinner dress, and came and sat beside him. And he reached over for the tassels of her wrapper and toyed with them, tossing them back and forth on her hand; and finally, possessing himself of the hand, bent the shapely fingers back and forth at his will, while he chatted with her about a dozen careless nothings, as they had not chatted together actually for years; and Ruth's eyes were bright and her heart was glad. She began to see her way out of the mazes of discomfort which had surrounded her. She was somewhat astonished that the door of comfort seemed opening to her by way of the society which she had so much dreaded. But why not, after all? She had enjoyed the gathering herself; she knew how to entertain people, and she knew how to manage her domestic concerns so that that portion of the entertainment could always be a success. What had she been thinking about, all these months, not to take matters into her own hands and bring to their house, with her invitations, such people as she would enjoy meeting? Scarcely a name on the list which her husband had given her, but it was an honor to entertain. Suddenly, into the midst of her complacent musings, came her husband's voice. "By the way, Ruth, have the girls spoken to you about having a social gathering here, chiefly of young people?" "Well, they will," in response to Ruth's negative reply. "They have had it in mind for some time, and have been quite patient, I must say, for girls. I told them that of course while the lady of the house was in mourning, anything very general in the way of company would be in bad taste; but that as soon as we could comfortably bring it to pass they should be gratified. We must do something especially attractive, I suppose, in return for their long waiting. I believe I will have Tarrant's band come out. That would be unique, and save an immense amount of trouble. What is your judgment about the floors? Would you rather have the carpets taken up, or simply covered for the occasion? If you are proposing to make any changes as to carpets in the spring, perhaps they might as well be taken up now as at any time." To all of which Ruth listened with great sinking of heart. She was evidently supposed to be making ready for a dancing party, and on a somewhat magnificent scale. She waived the question of carpet, and launched another. "Judge Burnham, don't you remember that I do not endorse dancing parties?" Her manner was timid, almost appealing; as one would speak who dreaded exceedingly to broach an unpleasant theme; but the master of the house neither frowned nor growled. Instead, he laughed. "I don't remember. There were so many things that you did not endorse, you know. How could I be expected to bear them all in mind? However, the girls will not require you to endorse their amusement, I fancy. They need you to play the lady hospitable to their guests. You need not be bored for more than an hour or so, you know." Poor puzzled lady of the house, trying to walk two opposite ways at the same time! She glanced at the handsome man who was resting so luxuriously among his cushions, then looked down at her prisoned hand, and sighed. The way was certainly bewildering. She tried again. "But, Judge Burnham, you do not understand. How can I receive guests to my house and provide for them an entertainment of which I do not in the least approve? Would there not be something dishonorable in that? Beside, I would be placing myself in a false light before the world." "But, my dear, you are not expected to approve. If one had to approve of all the silliness which goes on under one's own roof, even during the giving of a dinner party, it would be a tremendous strain on one's common sense. You cannot manage society, my queen, however much you may grace it; and I am willing to own that few women can match you in that." She knew he had answered her with sophistry, and with flattery. Never mind, she would put the question in another form. Judge Burnham, ought one to offer to others that which one believes may be a temptation and a snare? If I think there is actually harm in dancing, ought I to have anything to do with providing it as an amusement?" "You needn't," with a good-natured laugh. "I will engage the band, and have the house put in proper array, and you may retire to your room with the first strain of gay music. I will even engage to lock you in, if you fear the temptation to indulge will be too much for you." What reply could she make to this, other than to look steadily at him with sorrowful eyes? When his laugh was over, he added, still good-naturedly, and with a careless yawn: "What about dancing, my dear? Wherein lies the harm? Did you ever post me? If so, I have fallen from grace. I cannot recall a single argument for your side. Do you want to refresh yourself by putting me through a course?" How instantly was Mrs. Burnham carried back to the days when she was Ruth Erskine, to Marion's dingy little upper room in the boarding house, to Eurie Mitchell's merry words, half on one side of the question, half on the other; to Flossy Shipley's sweet young face. How earnestly, Bibles in hand, had they four discussed this very question years ago! How easily, in the light of Flossy Shipley's Bible verses, had they settled it! She could seem to hear Marion's voice again saying: "Girls, we have spent our strength vainly. It is our privilege to get up higher; to look at all these things from the mount whereon God will let us stand if we want to climb." And then they had climbed, those girls. They were standing, at least so far as these trying little beginnings of religious experience were concerned, away above them, troubled by them no more. All save herself. Here was she, after the lapse of years, sitting beside the one with whom she had spent the most of them, and he had gotten no farther than the old worn-out query, "Wherein lies the harm?" The solemn question was, did this tell something of her own spiritual state? Chapter 9.